again, it's Gabe Morales with Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians. Today we have a special guest. His first time on the show. Mr. Jeffrey Stamm is a former DEA special agent. He's worked since the 1980s until just a few years ago, so he's very well versed on the evolution of Mexican drug trafficking organizations. And so he's going to describe to us a little bit about that history. Sir, welcome to the show. Thank you for being on.
Thanks for having me, Gabe.
All right. So can you start from the beginning then, as far as your knowledge? What happened there with the Mexican drug cartels? Why do we have this disease epidemic now in America that the Mexican drug cartels do provide the majority of the drugs that are coming to the United States? What happened?
Gabe, let me start out by saying that I think the drug issue, as it's evolved into what I think is narco-terrorism today, is the number one existential threat to the U.S. It is not white supremacism or domestic violent extremism, as Christopher Wray and our Attorney General say. It's the Mexican drug cartels. But actually, it's not really just Mexican drug cartels we're talking about. We're talking about the world's most violent and prolific narco-terrorist groups that happen to be based in Mexico. And these groups, all of which have their largest foreign presence outside of Mexico in our country. So let me start by saying that Americans every single year now spend over $150 billion a year buying illegal drugs. Roughly half of that, about $75 billion, ends up finding its way into the various coffers of the Mexican drug cartels inside Mexico. Now, that kind of money doesn't just destabilize countries. It allows these groups to be more powerful than the very federal government in Mexico in vast parts of the country, including the entirety of the 2,000-mile Mexico-U.S. border, some parts of which may be even on our side. Now, if you remember the Colombian cartels back in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, you know they were very, very good at combining international drug trafficking with new levels of violence. But today, the Mexicans make them look like pikers. In addition to new levels of violence that all of the Mexican cartels practice, which clearly fall into that realm we call terrorism, they've also become highly adept at what global economists describe as market diversification, both the vertical and the horizontal integration of markets. Vertically, meaning they've come to dominate every level of the supply chain, beginning of production, transportation, smuggling, wholesale distribution, even retail level drug sales on the streets of the US and increasingly the world. But also horizontally, meaning that the Mexican cartels have expanded beyond traditional Mexican drugs into, beginning in the 1990s, methamphetamine, and certainly, as we know, fentanyl, but also beyond drugs themselves into new types of organized crime, beyond what traditionally border into illegal mining, illegal logging. You know, there's a term they use in Mexico today called a huachicolero, which roughly translates into an oil pirate. Every 90 minutes today, it's been estimated that one of the Mexican cartels engages in an illegal tap on a Pemex oil pipeline to steal and then sell oil on the black market. It's about to bring that state-run oil company to its knees. Now, you can look at a map today, and there's lots of them on the internet of the various cartel territorial bounds inside Mexico, and those shift and evolve actually quite rapidly. But you don't necessarily have to be an expert on the Mexican territory, but you might want to know who's in your own backyard. Homeland Security actually estimates that the various Mexican cartels have a presence in over 3,000 American cities and towns today. They are here solely to sell dope to Americans. To get back to your question about the evolution of some of these drug cartels, clearly I think Mexicans have been involved in drug smuggling, actually smuggling per se, since the days of the Civil War, when they were smuggling Southern cotton across the Rio Grande into Mexico to sell on the black market to defeat the North. But clearly marijuana, heroin has been big in Mexico since the 1940s. But the two biggest drivers of shifting power from Colombia to the Mexicans was the 1980s South Florida Drug Task Force, which targeted a lot of the drug flows into South Florida from Colombia and from South America. Combined with number two, and this is actually the bigger of the two, extradition. When Colombia agreed to extradite their largest, most powerful drug kingpins, that caused a shift in the Colombians. Instead of just using Mexicans to transshipment dope into the U.S., they actually sold loads of cocaine and other drugs to them, and then they were owned from then on out by the Mexican drug cartels to distribute inside the U.S. If you want to talk about the evolution of the Mexican cartels into that realm we now call narco-terrorism, you have to go back to 1999 when the Mexican government established the Air Mobile Special Forces Group, known as the GAFIs. These guys were very well equipped, trained, highly compartmentalized, 350-man unit culled from the finest that the Mexican military had to offer, designed to go after the heart of every single one of the drug cartels. Highly trained in aerial assaults and counter surveillance, secure communications, redundant systems of every kind. But almost immediately, Fort Benning, Georgia, as I said, they were highly trained and also well into their subunit of the GAFIs, the Z unit, and Zeta is simply the letter Z in Spanish, as you know, defected en masse to go to work as the private mercenary army of the Gulf Cartel. Originally about 30 members consisting of the Z unit of the GAFIs. With them, they took their training, their tactics, their weapons, and they began to incorporate terroristic acts they picked up by watching video posted by Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now, all 30 original members of the Zetas have either been killed or captured, but not before they could rapidly expand by franchising gangs all throughout Mexico to rapidly expand their numbers. They set up training camps all over Mexico to train these new members in the same tactics and weapons and terrorist actions that became known for. Beginning in about 2005, the Zetas began decoupling themselves to form their own criminal enterprise from the Gulf Cartel and really rapidly came onto the scene by executing these terrorist acts against rival trafficking groups throughout Mexico. Now, as you can imagine, the rival traffickers didn't just respond in kind. It became sort of an escalating game of quid pro quo, where rival traffickers didn't merely cut off heads. They began to dismember bodies, display body parts in macabre public displays, along with what became known as a narcomanta, or a narcotics messaging banner, to tell the world what these body pieces or dead bodies represented. Unfortunately, it didn't just stay contained within the bad guys. It would incorporate targeting Mexican law enforcement as well. And I'm not talking about corrupt Mexican cops. They get killed every day down there working for the wrong side. And as a former high-level government official from the U.S., formerly assigned to Mexico, once told me, the corruption in Mexico is beyond anything you can imagine. It's breathtaking. So we started seeing some of these terrorist acts targeting vetted, trained, honest Mexican federal agents handpicked to work with their counterparts from DEA and HSI. Tortured, killed, stacked like cordwood on the side of the freeway in every violation of civilizational standards I know. That's not mere crime, that's terrorism. And it calls for the tools and the resources of counterterrorism.
That was a good explanation of what occurred. So what, in your long experience and career, what do you think we can do? Just arresting these guys doesn't seem to do a lot of good, because it seems like then they just replace them with somebody else, possibly even more vicious than the guy before. And we are seeing a balkanization, a lot of people have called it, of the cartels. Now it's just not 5 or 6. Now it's a couple dozen different cartels, although they're still the dominant ones. Mencho of the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación and Sinaloa seem to be the two big dogs in the fight, but there's dozens of smaller cartels. And so what can be done? I mean, it seems like it's almost like they're doing a supply and demand type of thing. Until we cut the demand here in the U.S., this is just going to continue, is it not? Or what do you think can be done to change this direction we're in?
Well, clearly there is a supply and demand element to this whole thing, but I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area currently, and if you look back in about 2006, 7, there was a new drug on the scene back then called cheese, and it was essentially Mexican black tar heroin mixed with an over-the-counter cold medicine that was actually targeted to be sold to junior high school students. So clearly there's a demand that drives supply, but there are organizations out there actively pushing drugs, new types of drugs, creating new markets. Clearly, I think the best thing we can do right now would be to secure our southern border. That's increasingly difficult given the deep ties that we have with Mexico relative to commerce. But that's certainly the best thing we can do to protect our country. It's also important to know that the U.S. has less and less of a role relative to Mexican drug trafficking globally than we used to. Much of the violence you see in Mexico today, especially as you talk about the two big kids on the block, the CJNG and the Sinaloa, are violent turf disputes, not just for control of plazas or corridors into the U.S., but increasingly they're frictions that occur in Africa for drug trafficking routes into Europe itself, precursor chemical acquisition in Asia. These are what drug policy experts describe as actual Mexican cartel foreign policy throughout the world. You know, it's also important to know that there were so many people that touted the fact that if we just legalized marijuana in our country, it would starve the cartels. They would dry up as far as a drug threat. Nothing's been further from the truth. All they did was really two things. They branched out into other global markets to include Brazil, which is a huge marijuana consumer. You know, just last year, we had 3 tons of marijuana seized in the port of Lázaro Cárdenas, destined for Santiago, Chile, to that market. But secondarily, we have a lot of people saying that the Mexican cartels had actually branched out into, as we talked about, the horizontal diversification into synthetics, including fentanyl, based upon the reduction of profits from the marijuana trade. So these folks are not going to give up power and money easily. And right now we have a very appeasement-oriented government in Mexico with AMLO. In fact, if you take a look at one catalyst, one watershed event that one can point to where the drug cartels had morphed into a narco state in control of Mexico, it was October 17th, 2019, when the Mexican government set out to capture Ovidio Guzman, also known as El Capito, one of the 3 Chapito's sons of Chapo Guzman. And the Mexican military forces, with a very sophisticated operation, did in fact capture Ovidio Guzman. But almost immediately, the Sinaloa drug cartel responded with such a violent, overwhelming paramilitary counterassault that it ended up being excuse the pun, a Mexican standoff, where the president of Mexico himself, AMLO, stepped in and ordered his own troops to surrender and cough up the prisoner. Now, such a stunning decision that he came to, saying we do not want war with the cartels, failing to realize he's already in one, had, in my opinion, just led to the surrender of an entire sovereign nation to the thugs and desperados. Just like the warlords in Afghanistan, it's the narco-terrorists running things in Mexico today. So that's going to be very, very difficult to reverse, especially as the cocaine market's been saturated in our country. It's continuing to grow a little bit, but clearly synthetics rule the day, not just fentanyl, but methamphetamine. But the Mexicans are also becoming highly adept at moving methamphetamine and Colombian cocaine to other parts of the world. It's actually pretty astonishing to me, as a guy who worked Colombian cartels for many years in DEA, that the Mexican cartels have not just stepped in to oversee the acquisition of cocaine in Colombia. They've actually become the overlords. They've supplanted the Colombian cartels as the heads of cocaine production in that country. So we're seeing Mexican organizations move multi-ton loads into places like West Africa to commingle cocaine loads with legitimate cargo to bounce into Western Europe. We're seeing Mexican organizations not just fund cocaine production, but even fund down to the cocalero level, the peasant coca farmers. They're funding warehouses and shipping, drug production labs for themselves. So increasingly, we're going to start seeing more cocaine move to other parts of the world, and the U.S. will be less of a consumer market and therefore less of a driver of the strengthening of the Mexican cartels. Now, Venezuela is an interesting place to look at right now, too, because you've got a perfect storm of drug traffickers, i.e. Mexican and Colombian, cooperating with remnants of communist insurgent groups like the FARC, M19, and ELN operating there on the border with Venezuela. Along with that third element there, the Venezuelan government itself. Talk about collusion. It's getting very difficult to go after criminal organizations via criminal law versus any other potentially, say, military action when they've got actual governments working with them.
Venezuela, since Hugo Chavez and even probably before that, does not have very good relations with the U.S., so they definitely are not going to extradite anybody who is not an enemy to the state. If they're an enemy to the U.S., that's fine by them. Very similar to Cuba and Castro. He anybody who's a threat to him, of course, he took care of them. Threat to the United States, hey, no big deal.
Well, that's very true. But, a lot of people forget that just in the last year of the Trump presidency, 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted Nicolas Maduro, the president, and 14 of his top cabinet officials for narco trafficking and money laundering in conjunction with some of the Colombian FARC elements. So, and now we've got this current administration going down there begging for oil. It's really a sort of a witch's cauldron there. To go back and look at some of the U.S. domestic drug problems here, all of which are fueled by the Mexican drug cartels. Clearly, everybody knows today we have a huge fentanyl problem in our country. But America doesn't really just have an opioid problem, which is all we really hear about, and most of that's a good thing. But America has a drug problem. Clearly, of the 110,000 drug overdose deaths that we have now in the last 12-month period, and that number is continuing to rise, that's about 300 every single day. Now, I asked a lot of folks that I talk to in law enforcement circles, what do you think the media would do every night if 300 dolphins were to wash up dead on our beaches every day? Well, clearly, you know the answer to that. But, we don't talk enough about the drug poisoning deaths in this country. But about 3/4 of those drug overdoses are driven from Mexican fentanyl. But it's also true that cocaine and methamphetamine overdoses are also on the rise. So once again, America has a drug problem. But here's a critical point that I think a lot of even our American law enforcement people don't stop to realize is that although methamphetamine only drives about 10 to 15% of all overdose deaths in our country, in terms of use and amount trafficked, methamphetamine is about 15 times the volume of opioids. So given the fact that we know, according to many studies since the 1960s and 70s, that illegal drugs drives about 2/3 of all of our crime in this country, both property and violent crime, aside from every single one of those tragic overdose deaths that opioids cause, methamphetamine really is 15 times the problem in terms of crime, violence, gangs, drive-by shootings, death and decay of every kind across our country. So I like to try to keep the fire lit in Americans' minds that the methamphetamine, at least relative to the crime problem, is 15 times more problematic than opioids.
Good points. I really appreciate that, sir, and coming on the show and explaining some of the current issues with drug cartels as well as resulting crime and tragedies and really a threat to our country. As you well put it, they've become narco terrorists, and it doesn't seem like this issue is going to end anytime soon. We got to deal with it. It cannot be like AMLO and some other politicians here in the U.S. and just close our eyes and hope that it goes away. It is with us to stay, and we got to deal with it head on. So thank you for giving us a good picture of how we got to where we are today. I appreciate you coming on the show once again, and I hope you come back on another time.
It would be my pleasure, Gabe. Thank you very much. And
Oh.
God bless you for what you do.
All right. Thank you, sir. Aloha from Hawaii.
Aloha.